Camp Como, Mississippi, May 1945. The war in Europe had ended 3 weeks earlier, and in a converted cotton warehouse beside the railroad tracks, 47 German women sat on wooden benches waiting for news of repatriation. Outside, magnolias bloomed white as surrender flags. Inside, Greta Muller folded and refolded the same letter, her hands shaking. She had written it in careful English. "Please let me stay." Around her, other women clutched similar letters, similar pleas. They had expected liberation. Instead, they dreaded it. Home meant ruins, starvation, and something worse. The certainty that survival there would be harder than captivity here. The news came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, the Women's Army Corps officer who supervised the camp. She stood in the doorway of the barracks, clipboard in hand, her expression unreadable. "Repatriation orders came through," she said. "You'll be shipping out in 6 weeks, back to Germany." Silence filled the room. Then someone started crying, then another. Within seconds, the sound spread like fire through dry grass. Women weeping into their hands, into their pillows, into the cotton-scented air of a Mississippi summer. Lieutenant Morrison had expected relief, perhaps even celebration. Instead, she watched 47 German women collapse into grief at the prospect of going home. She closed the door quietly and walked to the camp commander's office. Colonel James Whitaker sat behind his desk, reviewing paperwork. He looked up when Morrison entered. "They're not taking it well," she said. "The repatriation news? Sir, they're devastated. I've never seen anything like it." Whitaker set down his pen. He had commanded Camp Como for 18 months, overseeing the German women who had been captured in various circumstances. Some had been nurses attached to military units, others auxiliary personnel. A few had been civilians caught in North Africa working for German companies. All had ended up here, in a converted warehouse in rural Mississippi, where they worked in local factories, ate 3 meals a day, and lived in conditions better than most civilians in Europe. "They don't want to go home," Morrison continued. "Several have asked me directly if there's any way they can stay." "That's not possible," Whitaker said. "Geneva Convention requires repatriation after hostilities cease." "I know the regulations, sir. I'm just telling you what's happening." That evening, Greta Muller sat on her bunk, staring at the letter she'd written and rewritten a dozen times. She was 28 years old, born in Hamburg, trained as a secretary. Before the war, she had worked for a shipping company. When the war came, she was conscripted into auxiliary services. Clerical work, filing, typing reports she tried not to read too carefully. She had been captured in Tunisia in 1943, transported to America along with hundreds of male prisoners, then separated and sent to Camp Como. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of regular meals. 2 years of work that paid a small wage. 2 years without bombs falling, without air raid sirens, without the smell of burning that had filled Hamburg during her last weeks there. 2 years of something that felt dangerously close to peace. And now they wanted to send her back. Beside her, Anneliese Fischer, 32, former nurse from Berlin, wrote in her diary, the small leather-bound book she'd kept since capture. May 15th, 1945. Lieutenant Morrison told us today we'll be going home. Home. I cannot write that word without feeling sick. What home? Berlin is rubble. My apartment building was destroyed in 1944. My mother and sister, I don't know if they survived. I wrote to the Red Cross months ago and received no answer. Home means searching through ruins for people who might be dead. Here, I have a bed, meals, work that matters. The factory where we sew uniforms is hiring American women now that the war is over. Mrs. Patterson, the supervisor, asked me yesterday if I wanted to stay on. I said yes before thinking. Then I remembered I have no choice. The next morning, Greta approached Lieutenant Morrison during breakfast. The mess hall was quiet, women eating in silence, the usual chatter replaced by a heavy, waiting stillness. "Lieutenant," Greta said in careful English, "may I speak with you?" Morrison nodded. They stepped outside into humidity so thick it felt like cloth against skin. Morning sun made the magnolia petals glow. "I know the rules," Greta began, "about repatriation. But I need to ask, is there any way to stay, any program, any sponsorship?" "I'm sorry," Morrison said. "There isn't. The Geneva Convention is clear. Even for women who have no homes to return to, no family?" Morrison's expression softened. Even then, Greta was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you know what's happening in Germany now, Lieutenant?" "I've seen the newsreels." "Then you know. Cities destroyed, food scarce. The regime's forces, the ones who believed most strongly, they're being hunted, but also the ones who just survived, who just tried to live through it. No one distinguishes. Everyone is guilty, or everyone is starving, or everyone is homeless. Probably all three." She paused, choosing words carefully. "Here, I am a person who sews uniforms and gets paid and eats dinner. There, I will be a German woman in 1945, which means I will be whatever people decide I am. Probably nothing good." Morrison had no answer. What could she say? That America couldn't keep 47 German women because regulations were regulations. That they had to return to a country that no longer existed in any recognizable form. "I'm sorry," she said again. The words felt useless. Inside the barracks, the women began organizing. If they couldn't stay officially, perhaps they could stay unofficially. Perhaps Americans could be convinced to sponsor them, to marry them, to find some loophole in the labyrinth of post-war regulations. Annalisa, who had worked as a translator for the camp administration, had the best English. She volunteered to draft a petition. That evening, she sat at a table in the common room. Other women gathered around and wrote, "To whom it may concern, we, the undersigned German women held at Camp Como, Mississippi, respectfully request consideration for remaining in the United States following the end of hostilities. We understand this request is unusual and perhaps unprecedented. However, we believe our circumstances warrant special consideration." She paused, pen hovering over paper. "How do you explain to Americans, who had won, who were returning to intact homes and living families, that victory meant something different when you were on the losing side? That liberation for them meant devastation for others?" She continued, "We have no homes to return to. Many of us have no surviving family. Germany, as we knew it, no longer exists. We do not ask for citizenship or special privilege. We ask only to remain where we have found safety, where we have worked honestly, where we have been treated with more humanity than we expected or perhaps deserved." 47 women signed it. Greta signed in careful script. Annalisa signed with a hand that trembled slightly. Helga Schmidt, who had cried every night for the first month of captivity but had grown strong working in the camp garden, signed with firm strokes. Lieutenant Morrison delivered the petition to Colonel Whitaker. He read it twice, then set it on his desk and rubbed his eyes. "What am I supposed to do with this?" he asked. "Forward it to headquarters? And then what? They'll send it back with a stamp that says, 'Request denied.' These women are prisoners of war. The war is over. They go home. That's how it works." "Sir, with respect, these aren't ordinary circumstances. No circumstances in war are ordinary, Lieutenant. That doesn't change the rules." But Morrison saw something in his expression, a hesitation, a recognition that the rules didn't account for women who would rather stay prisoners than accept liberation. Over the following weeks, the women of Camp Como tried everything. They wrote letters to congressmen, to church groups, to anyone they thought might intercede. They offered to work without pay, to accept any conditions, to renounce any claims to citizenship if only they could remain. The responses, when they came, were variations on the same theme. Impossible. Regulations. Sorry. Greta stopped eating. Not from despair exactly, but from a kind of numb resignation. Food tasted like cardboard. Sleep came in fragments. She worked her shifts at the factory, sewing straight seams on uniform shirts, her hands moving automatically while her mind circled the same thought. 6 weeks. Then 4 weeks. Then 2. Mrs. Patterson, the factory supervisor, a widow whose son had died at Normandy, noticed Greta's decline. She pulled her aside one afternoon, away from the other workers. "You're not eating," she said. "I'm fine, ma'am." "No, you're not. None of you are." Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment, her hands moving through the fabric on the cutting table, smoothing wrinkles that weren't there. "I asked the company if they could sponsor you. To stay, they said no. Immigration law, repatriation requirements, a dozen reasons." Greta nodded. She'd expected as much. "But I want you to know," Mrs. Patterson continued, "that if there was a way, I'd help. You're the best seamstress I've had in 15 years. You show up on time, you work clean, you don't complain. That matters to me." "Thank you," Greta whispered. "I don't understand it," Mrs. Patterson said. "I lost my son to Germans, to people like you, or at least to the forces you were part of. I should hate you, but instead I'm standing here wishing there was a way to keep you safe." She shook her head. War makes no sense. Annalisa, meanwhile, had found a different approach. She had befriended one of the camp guards, a corporal named Thomas Webb, who had taught her American slang and brought her books from the local library. They met in the evenings sometimes, sitting on the porch of the administrative building, talking about nothing important. Weather, books, the strange patterns of Southern life. One evening, 3 weeks before the scheduled departure, Webb said, "I could marry you." Annalisa stared at him. "What?" "I could marry you. If we were married, maybe you could stay. There must be provisions for that." "Thomas, I'm serious. I've thought about it. You're smart, you work hard, and He paused, choosing words carefully. "I care about what happens to you." Annalisa felt something crack inside her chest. Not love, exactly. They barely knew each other, really. But the kindness behind the offer, the willingness to tie his life to hers to keep her from being sent back to ruins was almost unbearable. "That's very generous," she said quietly. "But I can't accept." "Why not?" "Because you'd be doing it out of pity, because it wouldn't be real, and because even if we did marry, the army would probably still send me back. They'd say it was a marriage of convenience, which it would be." She touched his hand briefly. "But thank you for offering, for caring." Webb nodded, looking away across the darkening fields. "It's not right," he said. "What's happening to you all? It's not right." "Many things in war aren't right," Annalisa said. "That's what makes it war." As June approached, the mood in Camp Como grew darker. Women who had been cheerful, who had laughed and sung while working, grew silent. Some stopped caring for themselves, let their hair go unwashed, their bunks unmade, their clothes wrinkled. Others went the opposite direction, cleaning obsessively, organizing their meager possessions, as if perfect order could somehow prevent the inevitable. Lieutenant Morrison watched it happen and felt helpless. She had commanded women in difficult circumstances before, but never like this. Never women who were being punished with freedom. She tried explaining it to her husband during one of his visits. Captain David Morrison had been stationed in France during the war, had seen combat, had returned home with stories he mostly kept to himself. But he understood war in ways she was still learning. "They're scared," she told him, sitting in the small office she used for private meetings. "Terrified, actually, of going home." "What are they scared of?" David asked. "Everything. Starvation, homelessness, violence, being blamed for things they had no control over, being German in 1945. David was quiet. Then he said, "You know, when we liberated towns in France, in Belgium, after the Germans pulled out, there were women there who'd been with German soldiers. Relationships, romances, survival arrangements, whatever you want to call it. And when liberation came, those women were shaved bald, paraded through the streets, beaten sometimes. Liberation for them was punishment." He paused. "I imagine German women are facing something similar. Except they're also German, which means they get blamed for the whole war." "So, what do I do?" Morrison asked. "Nothing. There's nothing you can do. The regulations exist for a reason. You send them home and hope some of them make it." "That's not enough." "No," David agreed. "It's not, but it's all there is." 2 weeks before departure, Greta received a letter. It had been forwarded through the Red Cross, delayed by months of chaos. The envelope was dirty, creased, the address barely legible. Inside, a single page written in her mother's handwriting. "Greta, I don't know if this will reach you. Hamburg is gone. Not all of it, but enough that nothing looks familiar. The apartment is destroyed. I'm living with your Aunt Margot in the countryside. There's no work, little food. We survive, but barely. If you're alive, if you receive this, know that I love you, and I'm glad you're safe wherever you are. Don't come home if you can avoid it. There's nothing here for you now. Your mother, Clara." Greta read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. That evening, she showed it to Annalisa. "My mother says not to come home," she said, her voice hollow. "Mine is probably dead," Annalise replied. "I haven't heard anything in over a year." They sat in silence, these 2 women who had survived war and capture, and 2 years in Mississippi, who had learned to speak English and sew uniforms and eat fried chicken without crying at the waste of meat, who had expected cruelty from their captors and found instead a kind of exhausted decency, who had been told they were the enemy and treated like human beings anyway, and now they were being sent home to a country that didn't want them, that couldn't feed them, that would blame them for surviving when so many others hadn't. "We could run," Greta said suddenly. "What?" "Run, escape, hide. America is enormous. We could disappear." Annalisa considered it. For a moment, the idea felt possible. But then reality reasserted itself. They had no money, no contacts, no way to live without being discovered. And if they were caught, which they would be, they'd face punishment and still be deported. "No," she said finally. "We couldn't." The night before departure, Colonel Whitaker called an unusual assembly. All 47 women gathered in the mess hall, Lieutenant Morrison standing beside the colonel, her expression carefully neutral. Whitaker cleared his throat. He had prepared remarks, formal words about duty and regulations and the requirements of international law. But standing there, looking at these women who were about to be sent back to devastation, the prepared speech felt obscene. Instead, he said, "I know you don't want to go home. I know you've asked to stay. I know that if there was a legal way to grant your request, many people here would support it." He paused. "But there isn't. The Geneva Convention requires repatriation of prisoners after hostilities cease. America signed that convention, and we honor our commitments." Someone in the back started crying. "However," Whitaker continued, "I want you to know that your time here has not been wasted. You've worked hard. You've contributed to the war effort, ironically, by producing supplies for our forces. You've been model prisoners, and you've shown many Americans, myself included, that the enemy isn't always what propaganda makes them out to be. He looked around the room, meeting eyes, acknowledging the humanity he saw there. I can't let you stay, he said, but I can tell you this. You will be given repatriation packages with food, clothing, and a small amount of currency. You will be transported as safely as possible, and you will carry letters of recommendation from this camp testifying to your character and work ethic. If you choose to apply for immigration in the future through proper channels, these letters might help. It wasn't much, it was almost nothing, but it was something, and in the silence that followed, several women nodded their acknowledgement. That night, Greta lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Around her, other women whispered, cried, slept restlessly. Tomorrow they would board trains heading east, then ships heading across the Atlantic, then whatever transportation existed in the chaos of post-war Europe. Tomorrow they would return to being German women in 1945, with all that implied. She thought about the letter in her pocket, her mother's careful handwriting. Don't come home if you can avoid it. But she couldn't avoid it. None of them could. Annalisa climbed down from the upper bunk and sat beside Greta. Neither spoke for a long time. What was there to say? They had tried everything. They had begged, petitioned, offered to work without pay, to accept any conditions. They had written letters to people they'd never met, hoping someone, somewhere, would see their situation and intervene. No one had. "Do you think we'll survive?" Greta asked finally. "We've survived this far," Annalisa said. "We'll find a way." But her voice carried no conviction. The morning came too quickly. Breakfast was served early. Scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter, coffee, the last American meal. Women ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Outside, 2 transport trucks waited, engines idling. Lieutenant Morrison supervised the loading of bags, small duffel bags containing the meager possessions each woman had accumulated. Clean clothes, soap, a few books, letters from home when home still existed. The repatriation packages Colonel Whitaker had promised sat in boxes in the truck beds. Canned food, chocolate bars, cigarettes for trading, occupation marks that might or might not hold value in the ruins of Germany. Greta boarded the first truck. She found a seat near the back, pressed against the canvas side. Annalise climbed in beside her. Around them, other women settled into silence, faces turned away from the camp they were leaving. The trucks pulled away at 8:30. Greta watched through the gap in the canvas as Camp Como disappeared behind them. The converted warehouse, the mess hall, the factory where she'd spent hours sewing seams, the magnolia trees now past blooming, their white petals scattered on the ground like surrender. None of the women spoke. The truck rolled through Mississippi countryside, cotton fields, small towns, crossroads where people stopped to watch the military convoy pass. To them, it probably looked routine. Prisoners being transported, part of war's endless bureaucracy. They couldn't know that inside the trucks, 47 women were being transported toward something worse than captivity, toward a liberation that felt like exile. At the train station in Jackson, they transferred to passenger cars, better conditions than POWs usually received, another small mercy that felt like mockery. The train headed northeast, toward ports where ships waited to cross the Atlantic. 3 days later, they arrived in New York Harbor. The city rose before them, buildings intact, lights bright, people moving with purpose through streets that weren't rubble. It looked like a fantasy, a place where war happened somewhere else to someone else. Another truck ride, this time to a staging area where hundreds of German prisoners waited for ships. Men and women kept separate, organized by capture date and destination. Processing took hours, paperwork, medical checks, assignment of berths. Greta stood in line, answered questions mechanically, received a boarding pass for a ship called the Marine Falcon. Departure tomorrow evening. Destination, Bremerhaven. After that, she had no idea. The Red Cross would help with temporary housing, with locating surviving family members. But after that, everyone was on their own. That final night on American soil, Greta couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk in the staging barracks, listening to the sounds of New York beyond the wire. Traffic, voices, life continuing. She thought about the letter she'd written to Lieutenant Morrison, left on her bunk at Camp Como. Thank you for treating us like human beings. Thank you for showing us that enemies can be decent to each other. Thank you for making these 2 years bearable. I'm sorry we asked for something impossible. We know you would have helped if you could. She wondered if Morrison had found it, wondered if it mattered. The Marine Falcon departed on schedule, carrying 3,000 German prisoners back across the Atlantic. The voyage took 8 days. Greta spent most of it on deck, staring at the water, watching America disappear behind them. Annalisa found her there on the 6th day. They stood side by side at the rail, neither speaking, both watching the endless ocean roll past. I'm going to try to come back, Annalisa said finally. Legally, through proper channels. It might take years, but I'm going to try. How? I don't know yet. Find a sponsor, learn a skill that's needed. Get married, maybe, to someone who actually wants to marry me. She smiled without humor. There has to be a way. And if there isn't, then I'll survive in Germany, like everyone else, like we always have. She turned to look at Greta. But I'm not giving up. They sent us back, but they can't stop us from trying again. Greta wanted to believe her, wanted to think that determination and work ethic and letters of recommendation would somehow overcome immigration quotas and post-war restrictions, and the simple fact that they were German women in a world that had no room for them. But mostly she felt tired. Tired of hoping. Tired of trying. Tired of believing things could be better when evidence suggested otherwise. The Marine Falcon docked in Bremerhaven on a gray morning, rain falling steady and cold. The prisoners disembarked in groups, processed through military checkpoints, handed over to German authorities, or what passed for authorities in the chaos of occupation. Greta stood on the dock, her duffel bag at her feet, and looked around. The city was rubble. Buildings stood like broken teeth, walls missing, roofs collapsed, windows empty as eye sockets. People moved through the ruins. Thin people, hollow-eyed people, people who looked like they'd forgotten what safety felt like. This was home. A Red Cross worker, American, approached her. Do you have family to contact? Greta nodded. My mother. In the countryside near Hamburg. We can help arrange transportation. It might take a few days. Thank you, Greta said automatically. The worker handed her a pamphlet. Information about aid services, housing assistance, employment programs. Then he moved to the next person, the next crisis, the next problem without solution. Greta picked up her duffel bag and walked toward the temporary shelter the Red Cross had established. Other women from Camp Como walked beside her, silent, separate. Some were crying. Others were expressionless, their faces carefully blank. They had begged to stay. They had tried everything. And in the end, they'd been sent back anyway, liberated into devastation, freed into a country that was less home than grave. That night, in a converted school building that housed displaced persons, Greta wrote a letter she would never send. Dear America, you sent us home. You had to, I understand that. Regulations, conventions, international law, but I want you to know what that means. Home is ruins. Home is hunger. Home is being German in 1945, which means being guilty of everything even when you're guilty of nothing. You fed us for 2 years. You gave us work, safety, something close to peace. Then you sent us back to this. I don't blame you. I understand, but I want you to know what your mercy cost in the end." She folded the letter and placed it in her diary, where it would stay for decades. Some of the women from Camp Como survived. Annalisa made it back to America in 1952, sponsored by a church group in Ohio. She became a citizen, worked as a translator, married an engineer named Robert Chen. She never forgot the years in Mississippi, the factory where she sewed uniforms, the moment she realized that captivity felt safer than freedom. Others weren't as fortunate. Helga Schmidt died of tuberculosis in a displaced persons camp in 1946. Erna Vogel never found her family and disappeared into the chaos of post-war Germany. Margot Klein married a British soldier and moved to Manchester, where she refused to speak German for the rest of her life. Greta survived. She made it to her mother's location, lived in a single room in her aunt's farmhouse, found work, eventually, in a factory making textiles. She married in 1948, had 2 children, built a life from the ruins. But she never forgot the letter she wrote. "Please let me stay." And she never forgot the answer. No. Years later, in the 1960s, when her daughter asked about the war years, Greta told her about Mississippi, about Camp Como, about magnolias blooming white, about factories and meals and American guards who treated prisoners like people. "It sounds nice," her daughter said. "It was," Greta replied. "That's why we begged to stay." "And they said no?" "They had to. Rules are rules." But even saying it, decades later, the words tasted bitter, because rules didn't account for women who had nowhere to go home to. Rules didn't account for the difference between liberation and devastation. Rules didn't account for 47 women who understood that sometimes prison was safer than freedom. The Geneva Convention required repatriation after hostilities ceased. America honored that commitment. The women of Camp Como went home. But home was gone, and they had known it would be. That's why they begged to stay.